This video will cover the last chapter of a lesson called Parliamentary, Democracies in the Making, which is about a compared history of political changes in France and Britain during the period from 1870 to the First World War. So after dealing with specifically political issues in part 1 and 2, by strictly political I mean that the lesson was about changes in the institutions and the political system. Part 3 will be more about one specific political issue. In fact, the newest political issue that was about to become extremely important in modern times, that is to say the social question. First of all, we need to define social question. This question demanded a response to sharp inequalities between the rich and the poor. These inequalities that had risen with the spreading of capitalism and industrialization. And so it was about giving a response to the demands of the urban working class that was asking for better working and living conditions and, in fact, a more fair economic and social system. In part A, we need to examine the social importance of the urban working class. It was something that was new in human history and really a defining aspect of the social changes that had occurred during the 19th century. But at the beginning of the 20th century, the contrast between Britain and France was still important. Indeed, if we have a look at this bar chart about the labor force structure by economic sector, so basically farmers, industrial workers in red, and people working in the services, we can see that at the beginning of the 20th century, in fact, Britain was still more industrialized than France. In fact, in France, only about 47% of the labor force were salaried. That it means that they earned a regular wage. And on the contrary, in Britain, there were already 90% of workers that were salaried. So on this aspect, Britain was much more advanced. And regarding sectors, well, approximately at the beginning of the 20th century, there were only 30% of the French labor force in the manufacturing sector, while it was more than 50% in Britain. This was due to the advance that industrialization had taken from the very beginning in the UK. This advance was still remarkable, geographically speaking, as illustrated on this map, on which you can see how dense was the industrial network of Britain from Glasgow in the north, in Scotland, to London. Most of Britain was actually industrialized, when in France, indeed a larger country, but industrial areas were more limited and were mostly in the north, and northeast in particular, and also in big cities like Paris or Lyon. But Britain was more industrialized, and its share of the world manufacturing output was still extremely important, and clearly more important than the share of France. What you can see on the graph that has just appeared is that the big change of the period is the emergence of Germany and the United States as major industrial powers. And we can see that the UK really kept on being an industrial leader of the world when France was a bit more struggling. So Britain was more industrial, and Britain was also much, much more urban. It was the most urban country in the world. All this is very coherent and show that in numbers and in shares, the urban working class had become the widest social group in Britain, and it was not yet the widest social group in France. Well, indeed, in France, a key characteristic of the French society until the first part of the 20th century was the persistence of a domination of farmers in the labor force, and so consequently a mostly rural population. Reasons for this persistence of rural France was probably political. Of course, you had the delay in the Industrial Revolution that happened a bit later in France than in Britain. But it must be said that the French Revolution and the instauration of the universal suffrage in 1848 were important factors of this specific economic and social situation of France. There was a large number of small farmers, many of which were small property owners, thanks to the revolution, or at least thought they could become property owners. For this reason, fertility of French women was rather low in the 19th century, much lower than the fertility of British women in the countryside. For this reason, the birth rate in France remained rather low, okay? And so the French countryside was not affected by overpopulation. Moreover, political regimes had constantly protected the farmers, precisely because they were voters, and they were the majority of the voters. It was true of the Second Empire, which was really the farmers were the political base of the Second Empire, and it was also true of the Third Republic. I mean, Republican politicians, if they wanted to be elected, they had to be kind with French farmers, actually. They had to keep farmers' support. It is, I think, rather illustrated on this propaganda poster of the French Republic for the centenary of the creation of the First Republic. Well, what you can see is that it's the image of a modern country that is supposed to be given, the best image of the country possible in the background behind Marianne. And what you see is mostly a rural country. The only element of modernity is the train, but the image that the Republic gave of France on that poster was still an image of a rural country. And one of the consequences of this situation was another difference between France and Britain in terms of population and demography. The importance of European immigrants. By the turn of the century, that is to say by 1900, there was more than 1 million foreign people living in France and working in France. They were mostly young adults, but increasingly with the decades, entire families of people mostly from Belgium and Italy that mostly lived in the east of the country, not only because these were the neighboring regions of their country, but also because they were the industrial regions. And in fact, this is the result of the low birth rate in France. In fact, France needed workers, and the industrialists, the owners of the factories, they liked to employ migrant workers because they viewed them as cheaper workforce and very obedient workforce as well. So France was absolutely the only country in Europe to experience an important immigration of foreign workers at the end of the 19th century. In comparison, in Britain, immigration from outside of the UK was almost equal to none. It does not mean that there was no economic migration, but immigrants were mostly from Ireland and from the rural areas. But you had many people from Ireland in Liverpool, in Manchester, or in London, but nobody from outside the UK. And in both countries, the identity of the urban working class was characterized by its very difficult living and working conditions. And during most of the 19th century, the elite in Britain and in France did not really care about the situation of the working class. It's in Britain that this issue is the most interesting to study because this is where you had the widest urban working class. Um, in France, like in Britain, I need to say a little thing about France. In fact, um, in France, throughout the 19th century, the bourgeoisie ruled supreme. Okay, even though there was universal suffrage, it was constantly the bourgeoisie, the people with a high level of education and high level of money and capital that governed the country. And the French Revolution, in fact, had failed in the end to really limit social inequalities. The social inequalities rose in France thanks to capitalism, and universal suffrage could do nothing against that. In Britain, the political situation was different, but the fate of the poor was also extremely difficult, and the elite was not interested in it. It's more than this. I think we can say that a very important element of the Victorian ideology, I mean the ideology of the Victorian era of the people in those days, was clearly against the idea that poor people should be helped by the government, by the state. In fact, the upper and middle classes, they strongly believe that poor people deserve their fate. And in this way, we could say that the Victorian ideology was really an anti-poor ideology. That is the reason why you had these poor laws, which were very harsh against the working class people. If you're looking for an intellectual, a thinker that had theorized this anti-poor vision, Samuel Smiles, the author of a very popular book called Self-Help, that was published in 1859, would be a good example. Here's a quote. "No laws, however stringent, can make the idle industrials, the thriftless provident, or the drunken sober. Such reforms can only be effected by means of individual action, economy, and self-denial, by better habits rather than by greater rise." So he did not believe that the fate of the poor was a consequence of their lack of rights. They should not be given more help, more security by the state. They were on their own. They should individually get better. And clearly that vision dominated throughout the 19th century in Britain. And London, for example, was famous not only for its glory, the glorious capital of a very big country and an empire. It was also famous for the great poverty of this working class population. You can see a traditional image of the poor living conditions of the working class on this engraving by French painter Gustave Doré. I would like to illustrate it with another quote taken from a book of the 19th century. It's a book called The Idle Poor, a forgotten book, but you can see the anti-poor ideology in it. The quote is about working class poor people. "As a rule, he is not an ordinary person, but one who is constitutionally a pauper in his blood and bones. He is made of inferior material and therefore cannot be improved up to the level of the ordinary person." You know, if these lines were about somebody from Africa, for example, we would call that racism. It's about poor people, poor British people. It's a form of social racism, clearly. So, with such ideas dominating political debate, it's no surprise that the poor laws of the 19th century were very harsh. We already talked about that this year. Uh, the main point of the laws about the fate of poor people in Britain was that it was forbidden to help them for the government in the streets and in their houses. If they wanted help, they had to go to places called workhouses. Were in fact some kinds of prisons where people were accommodated, they had to work, and they were given food and a roof, but they were not free. And so men were living with men, children were living with children. In Oliver Twist, the beginning of the story takes place in a workhouse where the orphan Oliver Twist is a prisoner, in fact. And the women were also on their own in their own workhouses. People hated that, and that's a good illustration of how harsh the Victorian society was towards the poor. Charity was, of course, not absent. That was seen as a very important Christian value, but this was not new. Charity became a bit more institutional by the end of the 19th century, and this can be illustrated with this Charity Organization Society that was created in 1876. But in the text defining the rules of this organization, one sentence is a good illustration again of this great limitation of help that should be given to the poor. If the laborer is told that when problems arise, they will be met by state relief or private charity, he will assuredly make no effort to meet them himself. So, the idea that the poor should be helped was not a popular idea in Britain at all, and not that much in France as well.